Hello crafty friends, I hope this video finds you well. Today we are going to be looking at pigment powders and I'm going to take you through I think 21 different techniques that you can do with pigment powders. I do have a really in-depth series on pigment powders and I will leave a link to that playlist in this video's description. So if you want more detail on any of the techniques you see today, then check out that series. Right, let's dive straight into technique number one, and that is blending. So I've got a bottle of glycerin here, which is very similar to embossing ink, and I've put a few drops on my mat, and I've added some pigment powder. The pigment powders I'm using today are all indigo blue luscious powders, but most pigment powders will work in similar ways. Just give them a go and see how they look. And what I've done next is taken a sponge blender and blended the pigment powder with the glycerin and blended it on a piece of smooth white card. And this has given me a lovely, translucent, shimmery, shiny, pink blended area. Next, I did exactly the same thing with a teal colour. I did change blending sponges because I didn't want to mix the colours. So again, I just mixed the pigment powder with some glycerin and then gently blended it on. To finish off and to really smooth everything out, I brushed over it with a dry paper towel. On to technique number two now, and that's blowing. So I squirted quite a lot of water on a piece of mixed media paper here, and I'm using mixed media paper because it can handle lots of water. I then tapped on some pigment powder into the water, added more water, and then added some copper pigment powder. I did encourage the pigment powders to dissolve in the water with a paintbrush. Added more water, and then I blew at it with a straw to get the colours to mix and mingle and spread and splurge around. You can have lots of fun with this technique. You can create all sorts of web-like, branch-like, splat-like shapes. You could do just one colour, you don't have to mix colours, or you could mix several colours and try and keep them a little bit separate so you can get areas of blending and areas of pure colour. You can also blow with a hairdryer, a bit like you might do when you use alcohol inks. That's a fun technique too. For technique number three, we're doing some brayering. So I'm using a brayer, which is just a hard rubber roller. I've put some indigo blue gilding gum on my mat. You could use glycerin or embossing ink, and then I've added some pigment powder and blended it all together with my brayer. And then I brayered this onto some white card, so you can get quite a nice effect just by directly brayering onto card. You get the shimmer and shine with these powders and the gilding gum. I then brayered some onto some embossed card. I ran this card through my die cutting machine with an Argyle pattern embossing folder and then brayered on the gilding gum pigment powder mix, and that added colour to the raised portions of the embossed card. Next, I brayered some of the colour onto an embossing folder. I went for the Argyle pattern again, and I did it on both sides of the embossing folder. I popped a bit of card in, ran it through my die cutting machine. One side was more successful than the other. I think I put too much colour on one side. It was a bit squishy, I think, but the other side looked lovely. Instead of having the raised portions coloured with the gum powder combo, I had the indented portions of the pattern coloured with the combo. On to number four now, and that is brushing. So I put some water on my mat and then tapped in some purple pigment powder. I like to put the water down first because it captures the powder and stops it blowing off around my craft room. And then I mixed that with a paintbrush and brushed it onto a piece of mixed media paper. So you can brush with your pigment powders by mixing them with water. You could mix them with some kind of ink and brush that on too. Once my purple powder was dry, I added some green with a smaller brush just to show you can use them just like watercolours. Once they're mixed with water, they're really just paints. Now we're on to bubbling. So I've got some water here, warm water with some washing up liquid dish soap mixed in. I've added a dollop of pigment powder and stirred it around with my straw. And then I blew into the mixture through the straw. Definitely blow, don't suck, because you don't want to swallow this stuff. And what that does is it makes lots of big bubbles, which you can then press card down into. Now it's a little bit difficult to see here, but the bubbles take on the colour of the pigment powder, and when they stick to the paper and pop and dry, they leave bubble-shaped pigment powder patterns on the paper. Say that fast 5 times. The trick with this is to use a small amount of water and washing up liquid so that you can get a really concentrated colour without using too much pigment powder, I think. You could get away with using a lot less water than I used here. Once you finish with the bubbling technique, you don't have to throw the water away. You could use it to paint with. So I'm painting this piece of mixed media paper here, and I'm putting lots of the bubbles on, and I'm going to leave them to dry naturally. And as these bubbles dry and pop, the pigment powder will soak into the card and you get a really lovely effect. So that was a bubbling. Now we're on to a bubble wrapping. I've got a piece of bubble wrap on my glass mat here. I've squirted it with water and then I sprinkled on a couple of colours of pigment powder. I then squirted it again with more water to get that pigment powder to dissolve and move around. And then I pressed down a piece of mixed media paper onto my bubble wrap to make a print. I just smoothed over the back with my hands. And there you have a beautiful shimmery shiny bubble wrap pattern. There's still plenty of pigment powder left on the bubble wrap though, so I just gave it another squirt and pressed down another piece of card. The pattern was slightly fainter, more subtle, so you can definitely pull more than one print using this technique. Now we're on to technique 7 and cling filming. So very similar to bubble wrap. I just put cling film down on my mat. I scrunched it up a bit to create lots of mountains and valleys in the cling film, squirted it with water, sprinkled on some pigment powder, and then pressed a piece of mixed media paper down into it, flipped it over, scrunched up the cling film even more, and then I set it aside to dry naturally. And once it's dry, you can remove the pigment powder and you just get a really interesting pattern. You can do this with watercolours, with inks, all sorts. Technique number 9 is a dripping. I've mixed up some pigment powders with water and I've used a paintbrush to put them at the top of a piece of mixed media paper. I went for copper and green because I wanted to get a bit of a verdigris look. Once I was satisfied with the amount of pigment I had, I tilted my card up, tapped it to encourage the pigment powders to drip down the card. I also squirted on some more water to get some more dribbles forming, and I added some more paint at the top using a paintbrush. And you can get some really fun looks like this. You can create balloons, you can create flowers, you can create lollipops, all sorts of things. Anything with a blob at the top and a skinny tail. Trees. Use your imagination. The world's your oyster. Now from dripping to dropping, I just made up some more pigment powder and water puddles, picked them up with a pipette and then dropped them onto paper to get a nice splashy effect. I really could have done with making up my pigment powder water mix in some kind of palette or bowl to make it easier to pick up with the pipette, but I was being lazy and I couldn't be bothered to go and find one. Obviously, the more liquid you suck up into your pipette and squeeze out, the bigger your splats will be. For technique number 9, we're on to heat embossing. You can use your pigment powders for heat embossing, but you'll need to mix them with some kind of embossing powder. So I took some clear embossing powder, mixed it with one of the peachy copper pigment powders, And then I took a stamp that says Celebrate and stamped it on a bit of card in sticky embossing ink. And then I sprinkled my pigment powder, clear embossing powder mix over the top. After that, I melted it using my heat tool, and once it was cooled and set, I was able to buff off any extra pigment using a microfiber cloth. So before you rush out and buy any new fancy embossing powders, try mixing your pigment powders with your clear embossing powders or any of the other embossing powders that you've got. You can mix it with white to create some lovely pastel shades. Right, technique number 11, that is making paint. So we did look at brushing earlier, but with some pigment powders, those that contain binder already, you can make your own paints that stay in a palette as paint form. And that's what I've done with this DIY palette that you can see on the screen. I've put pigment powders in the wells, added water and then left them to dry, and that's left me with solid paints that I can then re-wet with a brush and use as a paint. And this is super convenient. It means you don't have to get your powders out when you want to use the paint for drawing, painting, splattering, what have you. You can just get your paint palette out. Now onto one of my very favourite techniques, the smooshing technique. There are lots of ways to smoosh, and I've just done 2 big videos about smooshing techniques. I think 22 ways to smoosh the tools edition and then 22 ways to smoosh the media edition. And you can use pigment powders to smoosh. Again, just mix them with water and then smoosh in the technique that works for you. I'm using my smoosher here, and if you want to know more about the smoosher, there is a video that I'll leave linked below. I often smoosh by picking up leftover ink from various other projects. Nothing ever goes to waste in my craft room, so if I've made up a inky painty mess, I'll pick it up with scrap card and then let it dry and pop it in my box of backgrounds and bits for use at a later date. You never know when these things are going to come in handy. Spattering is another technique you can do with pigment powders. Again, mix it with water, pick it up with a paintbrush, spatter it on or flick it on with a toothbrush. You can just use pigment powders and water, make them up as you go, like I've done here, or you can rehydrate paints that you've made with pigment powders, pick them up with a paintbrush and spatter them on. You can also take an ink, like I've done here, a green distress oxide, and I spritzed it with a spray, a DIY shimmer spray that I made with a white pigment powder and water. So now I've got a shimmery green paint on my mat, which I can pick up with a paintbrush and spatter on. Again, you can use this DIY shimmer spray to paint as well. Doesn't just have to be splattering, it could be painting or smooshing or what have you. For technique number 14, we're looking at sponging. I've got a sponge dauber here, just a flat round one on the end of my wooden handle, and I used it to pick up some purple and teal coloured pigment powders that I've mixed with water, and you can get a nice sponging effect with this. For this particular background, I dried this first set of sponged circles and then did another load of sponging over the top and gradually built up a fairly kind of mottled background, I'd say. Obviously, you can use any kind of sponge you like. It doesn't have to be a round one on a wooden handle. You could use a makeup sponge to sponge it on. You could use a natural sponge, a bath sponge. Just pick up your watery pigment powders and sponge them on however you'd like. Technique number 15 is spraying, and these are more DIY shimmer sprays. All I did was add some powder to some water, pop it in a mister bottle, and you can spritz away. Sprinkling is technique 16, and you can wet paper and then sprinkle pigment powders on and watch them move about and mix and mingle. You can add extra water, you can tilt, you can give it a poke with a paintbrush or some other tool, you can blow it with a straw. Or you can sprinkle your pigment powders onto dry paper and then spritz them with water. You get much the same effect, but when you spritz dry pigment powder, you run the risk of blowing it across your craft space. We're now on technique 17, which is stamping. So I've got a large rubber stamp here with quite a detailed map design on it, and I've inked it up with sticky embossing ink. I then pressed down some white cardstock and then some black cardstock down onto the stamp to transfer the ink onto the card. And then I sprinkled pigment powder over the stamped image and then pushed it around with my fan brush. And what happens is the sticky embossing ink grabs hold of the pigment powder and holds it in place, and you can brush off any excess with your brush and you're left with a beautiful shimmery stamped impression. And these pigment powders show up really well on dark cardstock, so you can see here how this purple and pink combination of powders really pops on that black cardstock. So we're still on stamping, but this is kind of the reverse of what I've just done. I covered a piece of black cardstock completely in sticky embossing ink, and then I sprinkled over a couple of pigment powders and spread them out with my fan brush so that I covered pretty much the whole of the front of this piece of card with a nice strong layer of pigment powder. I then inked up my stamp again with the sticky embossing ink and then pressed the card pigment powder side down onto the stamp and gave it a good rub on the back. I then peeled away the black cardstock, and what you can see is that the stamp has lifted pigment powder off of the black card. So you've got the stamped image in a sea of pigment powder, as it were. This process left pigment powder on the stamp, and so you can pop another bit of card on top and lift that impression, and you get quite a subtle stamped impression that's still colourful and shimmery. Stenciling is up next, and to stencil with my pigment powder today, I took some of the gilding gum that I used earlier, popped it on my glass mat, mixed it with some luscious pigment powder using a sponge dauber, and then I carefully blended it over my stencil here. So this is an adaptation of the blending technique that we did right at the start, but it's using a stencil. You can blend through a stencil. I used the gilding gum here because I thought I'd try and see how that worked. And it was okay, but it was a little bit juicier than I was hoping, and so the stenciled image wasn't as crisp as I'd have liked it to have been. So I did it again, but instead of mixing the pigment powder with a gilding gum, I mixed it with some Versamark sticky embossing ink re-inker, and I got a much cleaner, crisper image that way. Not only can you blend through a stencil with pigment powders, you can use your DIY shimmer sprays to spritz through a stencil as well. I do have a video called 25 ways to use stencils. If you're interested in that, I'll leave a link down below in the video description. Stippling is technique number 19. So again, I mixed a little bit of the luscious powder with some sticky embossing ink, and then I picked up a stippling brush. This is a brush that has a round brush, but the bottom is flat, or the top, whichever way you look at it, I suppose. And I just pounce that up and down, and that gives a lovely stippled effect. This works quite well through stencils as well. On to technique number 20 now, and that is swiping. So I mixed some pigment powder with water, picked it up with a sponge, and just swiped it across a piece of cardstock. I started with pink, but then I brought in a gold as well. I did do a second piece of cardstock, but didn't add much extra paint to it, so I got a much lighter look. And finally, we are on to our last technique, and that is waxing. You can make your own gilding waxes with pigment powder. You can use something like the indigo blue gilding gum, mix it with some pigment powder, pop it in a pot that you can seal the lid on, and it should last a while. But I've been making my own gilding waxes by mixing pigment powder with some beeswax and olive oil furniture polish, and that's all it is in there, beeswax and olive oil. And you get a lovely shimmery wax to burnish over your projects, as I'm doing here with this piece of embossed card. And that brings us to the end of our techniques. We've pretty much done an A to Z, or a B to W really, of pigment powder techniques. If you know of any others, or you use any others, do let me know in the comments, and maybe I can incorporate those into a future video. And if you found this video helpful, do check out my Pigment Powders 101 series for a little bit more detail. It tells you how to do the gilding wax step by step, and the DIY shimmer spray step by step, etc. Right, thanks for watching, and I'll see you very soon. Bye for now.